Welcome to the WattSherpa podcast, your guide to energy efficiency and savings.
I'm honored to speak today with Emily Barran, Green Industrialization Lead for CAP-A, the Climate Action Platform for Africa. Emily's joining us today from Nairobi, Kenya, and she has devoted her career to driving impact. Prior to CAP-A, she was a senior project leader at Open Capital, a management consulting and financial advisory firm focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to Open Capital, she worked for West London Zone, where she helped support children's education initiatives. And prior to that, she worked for Long Run Works, where she helped entrepreneurs scale their business and attract investment in Brazil. So, Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, you are very welcome. Pleasure to be here.
So, for my first question, I want to say one of my goals with WattSherpa is to help young students pursue their passion for the environment as professionals. So, to start, I'd love to understand just how you developed your own passion for impact and the academic journey that led to your career.
Yeah, happy to. And it's always a thrill when people ask you to talk about yourselves. Thank you for where we're starting. I started off my academic career. I was very lucky in that I was given a lot of freedom in my sort of school years and in my undergraduate. I'm British, so when I say school and high school, in my university, to really study what interests me. And at the time, that meant classics and philosophy, which was not necessarily the natural starting point for the career that I've had. But I think that maybe one theme I would pick up from that is just that the problems are huge and the work is hard. And if you don't enjoy it, it's really not worth it at all. And so finding the aspects that you find most interesting and really light your brain up is probably like one good starting point. I then tried and spectacularly failed to become a lawyer. And that led me then to go and work for a series of small organizations and realized really quickly that although I had some of the academic background for law, the things that I really enjoy is looking at a problem and understanding that there may be one right answer, but actually there could be 50 other potential interesting answers. And I think that sort of set me up quite well to work in quite complex problems and impact problems are generally quite complex. I think that's often something that people who come from more traditional commercial backgrounds don't always see is that actually the problems are much, much harder, particularly when humans are involved. When you can rely on a profit motive, the answer is really simple, right? It's what's most profitable, what's going to either increase my revenue or reduce my costs. And actually, when you're dealing with impact, you might be balancing 15 different things. And that complexity is something that I have always really enjoyed. So did some stints in the UK and then I went to business school. And that was a real pivot point for me. So I sort of had this quite experiential learning background. I didn't have a huge amount of technical knowledge, but I had a lot of hands-on experience. And so going to business school was an opportunity to, in theory, get some hands-on experience. I was lucky enough to go to Oxford, which tends to take quite a theoretical approach to things. So it's very focused on the ideas behind why the way things are. And I guess with my philosophy degree, that's appealed to me. And that means that you get to spend a lot of time in the realm of the possible, not in the realm of the actual. So you don't spend as much time maybe like crunching out financial models, but you do spend a lot of time thinking about why do we think about profitability in the way we do. And then the other thing that I really loved about it was that it's got a big focus on impacts. It prides itself on being a program with a very high proportion of women. I think the year I went, it was one of the highest globally among leading business schools, and also a big focus on students from Africa and African content. And I had no previous experience with working in Africa, but I was able to come on a field visit to Kenya organized by peers and classmates and friends who were Kenyan and South African who'd lived in Kenya. And that was a real moment of feeling like bringing together the commercial motive, which can really drive results, and the impacts that had driven my career to date was able to come together because you have this just huge gap where in Western countries, public sector kind of exists. And certainly what I'd experienced in the UK, the public sector exists. And so I joined Open Capital, which was a really fantastic sort of practical training. and gave me a huge exposure to different sectors and to different countries. And through that, I drilled down into wanting to focus on how does one create jobs and scale. And one of our co-founders, James Wangi, gave a kind of webinar or something that I happened to listen to, and he's described how climate action has to be synonymous with economic development and job creation for Africa, because Africa has the resources that the rest of the world needs to create the energy transition. It's got the people, it's got the power, potential, and it's got the minerals and the other natural and the carbon sinks. And that was a real kind of light bulb moment. And so that sort of then shifted my career to focusing on green industry and cafe.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned just how unique your background is for being in this career and in this field. And it's interesting because I think a large theme of what I've learned from building WattSherpa and doing other interviews is that a problem so large like climate change really requires a very multidisciplinary approach to be able to come up with a well-rounded solution. So I think your career path can really attest to that. You were just starting to talk about the Climate Action Platform for Africa, which is an incredible nonprofit that focuses on unlocking the potential for Africa to contribute to the fight against climate change. For people that don't know, Africa represents 18% of the world's population, but accounts for less than 3% of global CO2 emissions. And while Africa is seen more as a victim of climate change, it does have the potential to be one of the leaders in the fight against the crisis, given their abundant resources. So would you mind just telling me a bit more about CAPE, its mission, and your role there?
Yeah, absolutely happy to. So I started off, and you've set it up very well there, which is that talking about kind of the potential. And I think that was one of the big shifts in my career as well. I think a lot of traditional development focuses on needs and on gaps. And my work at West London Design and now my work here has always been to try and flip that narrative. And instead of focusing on what the problems are, to focus on what the assets, the opportunities are. In the case of where we see the role of Africa in terms of the kind of global fight is if you look at the progress we've made to date globally, which is depressing, and you look at even what the sort of current policy scenarios are. So even what governments have currently committed to in terms of cutting emissions and keeping warming within sustainable levels, we are nowhere near meeting what we need to meet. And so one of the potential solutions to that is some form of kind of carbon removal at scale. And you can both think about that on an engineered level, but you can also thinking about that on a changing how we produce what we currently need. And the other challenge we have is that historically, development and increasing GDP per capita has always moved in lockstep with increasing emissions per capita. And I'm afraid the US is like the sort of the worst exemplar of this. There are countries like Norway and Sweden who've done like a bit of a loop. So they've started to increase and then it's gone back again. But they've also mainly done that by pushing their emissions onto other people, right? So their wealth comes from oil, but they themselves are very green, which is a sort of nice intellectual fudge, but it comes to the same thing, right? And if Africa was to industrialize and achieve that development that collectively we all want, you would add, I think it's somewhere between 8 to 12, I'm going to get this not quite right, but gigatons to the world, which we just can't afford. We don't have the carbon budget to do that. But the moral argument you're making there, which is either stay poor or increase emissions, we can't do either of those, that neither of those are a tenable position. And so if you take a sort of opportunity lens, you flip this on its head, you actually see that Africa has got the potential to not only go net zero, but actually to go net negative and still increase economic development and reach kind of middle income status. And CAPE exists to try and achieve that vision. We call it climate positive growth. And what that means is basically three things. So one is preserve and increase our carbon sinks, which are absolutely critical. Two is grow through green industry. So industry driven by renewable energy and with appropriate, as it needs to be, carbon capture, et cetera, approaches that remove the emissions that are unavoidable. And then also to invest in carbon removal at scale. Kenya often comes up as the kind of example because it has whole bunch of unique features, which make it a perfect testing ground for some of this stuff. Kenya has geothermal resources, which can provide the sort of power that's needed to do engineered removals, things like DAC at scale, and has shown itself very open and has the climate leadership to take those forward. And so you could see a world in which, in relatively short time periods, Kenya becomes a net zero country. And that actually goes beyond that and becomes, in over time, a net negative country. And we think that there's a big opportunity to do this first in Africa because of the lack of industries. Again, that sort of mental frame of taking something which currently is a problem and flipping it and trying to make a virtue out of it.
I understand that one of the ways you guys are fulfilling or achieving these goals is by helping to attract funding for a wide variety of renewable initiatives. The continent has only received 2% of the financing for renewable projects in the past decade, despite, like you mentioned, its abundant resources. However, it seems like that may be changing. I just saw that Microsoft recently agreed to contribute to a $1 billion investment in Kenya, which does include the development of a green data center powered by geothermal. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how CAPE is working to increase these types of investments.
Yeah, and it's a great question because the money is a huge part of the challenge, and both the availability of capital and the cost of capital are two things that we work on quite actively. So on the availability of capital, we don't directly work on specific investments. So we act as a nonprofit and we really pride ourselves in our independence. And when you start getting involved directly in deals, that becomes very challenging to maintain. What we do is we work very actively to create the conditions in which investments could thrive. So what we know from our kind of collective experience, from my background as a management consultant, is there are projects and there is capital, and often the challenge is making the two meet in the middle at a price that everyone can agree on. And when you speak to investors in Africa, they'll say, we've got the capital, we need the projects. And when you speak to the projects, they say, we've got the projects, we need the capital. And so finding that point at which the two can agree on a price is often the challenge. And that's where the sort of what's often called the enabling environment plays a role, right? And that's both at the macro level. So we work on things like global financial architecture reform to try and bring the cost of capital down, which is one of the reasons why it's hard to deploy capital because it's just really expensive. And the other is on the specific conditions under which, for example, green industry projects might try and thrive. So to take that Microsoft deal as an example, or as an announcement for now, back in, I think, maybe like COP27, President Ruto started talking about this concept of climate positive growth and started reframing the narrative from one of victimhood and loss and damage to one of opportunity and doing business on a fair basis. That sort of momentum then led to the Africa Climate Summit in September in Nairobi, which was the first of its kind and yielded the Nairobi Declaration, which again built on this idea that each country could use its own unique assets to make a contribution and should be fairly compensated for that contribution. And this builds on a long stream of work behind it, right? It didn't just start at COP27, but it started to really crystallize and become very well understood sort of September, about a year ago. And then at COP28, there was an announcement of a bunch of green industry projects under something called the Africa Green Industrialisation Initiative. And the momentum from those things meant that President Ruto was the first African head of state to be invited for a US state visit in 16 years and had a bilateral at the White House. And the combination of those things and the sort of work that CAPE and others have been doing to really showcase Kenya's assets and the opportunity in Kenya led Microsoft to make that announcement of making that investment. I think other factors at play include the fact that Meg Whitman is the US's ambassador to Kenya, and she's done a fantastic job of kind of bringing the tech community to see the opportunity in Kenya, and several others, right? This is a long-standing kind of thing, but I think you can draw a line through those different items. And there's a lot of work going on at the government level to make sure that the conditions are right for a deal of that size. And there was a lot of work done by colleagues of mine to produce something called a Clean Energy White Paper, which set out how Kenya could get to 100 gigawatts of installed capacity. And this was a few years ago. Kenya currently has 3. So it's a huge ambition. But I think it shows how by painting that picture of what could be possible, you then can yield some really exciting kind of opportunities and investment like that Microsoft deal. I think the other thing that we would do and draw on is really trying to find those opportunities where there is a real commercial incentive to find the clean or green option. So data centers are a really interesting one because they take up a huge amount of energy. We know with AI, they're going to, I think it's increased at least 50%, even more in a very short order. And existing grids can't cope. So there are news stories from Ireland and Spain in the last few years that national grids are saying you can't build any more data centers here because we just can't, we don't have the power to service it. And at the same time, those companies are being hit with emissions trading schemes, which mean that they now have increasing need for those data centers to be run on green power. So then you start looking around the world, you're like, where is there somewhere where it's got huge amounts of power and they're very happy for us to build it and it can be relatively affordable? And suddenly places like Kenya start looking really exciting. So I think the other one that's an exciting one for us right now is the opportunity in alternative aviation fuels, because the EU has said that from next year, 2% of all fuel has to be from alternative sources if you're flying into the EU. So suddenly we're hearing airlines scrambling and saying, I don't care where it comes from. I just need some green fuel and I need it like yesterday. And that then suddenly the price challenges that still occur with projects from Africa and still occur with projects which are on renewables melt away because you've got regulatory drivers, which just mean that you don't have an option. You have to pay the price as a business.
Yes, I think it's clear that a lot of these investments are coming in because of lots of natural resources that these countries have that maybe companies are forced to achieve to meet regulatory standards. Africa is often seen as one of the largest sources of raw materials in the global supply chain. But then these materials are often shipped to other continents to be processed, which obviously significantly increases the carbon impact of the finished goods. So I was wondering what you think can be done in Africa to keep more parts of the supply chain localized.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. It's one we've been actively looking at and thinking about very clearly. The majority of the added emissions are from the production process. It's actually not from the transport. And beyond a certain point, whether you move the rock like 50 miles or 5,000 miles actually doesn't make that much difference. What makes a difference is the first 50. So the closer you can get to the mine site, the better. Often mine sites are not in super accessible areas and often they're very off grid. And so decarbonizing the energy sources for mining in itself is a really interesting opportunity. And there are some great businesses, not just in Kenya, but across Africa that are doing really interesting work, just getting power into mines to be greener. That's a sort of tangent, but interesting nonetheless. In terms of what can be done, we started from first principles. So everything we do, everything we try and recommend, we want it to make sure that it creates revenue. It's a source of revenue. It creates jobs, which is not always the same thing. And that it is decarbonizing in some way, right? So either avoiding emissions because you're moving from one power source to another, or when you look at mining value chains, what's really interesting is that you end up with a bit of a U curve when you look at some of those factors. So you actually end up creating marginally less revenue down to a certain point, and then increasingly marginally more revenue going up the other side. So if you imagine a lump of iron ore getting transformed into a car door that goes into a Ford or whatever, you make incrementally less money up to a certain point to make it into steel and then a certain type of steel. And then you make incrementally more money as it becomes the finished product in terms of the additional in each stage of the thing. And there's also an interesting relationship between power and jobs. So in a lot of these value chains, actually, the more power you need, the less jobs you create. So if you imagine a kind of massive steel mill, which is 1 kilometer long because you're doing that first kind of rolling and you've got these kind of rolls of steel, you actually don't need that many people to run that process, even though you're creating a huge amount of value and you're using a huge amount of power. And so what we've been trying to do is to look at where are the kind of sweet spots between those things, where countries are going to get the best bang for their buck in terms of the job creation. And that's ongoing work, and everything we do, it'll be published in due course. But what we're seeing is that you probably need to capture a few of the steps to get both the emissions benefits and the jobs benefits. So you don't just want to do one or two, you want to do two or three. What's tricky is from a policy perspective is that there's a lot of energy at the moment around what's often called resource nationalism. So the idea that we should be totally independent and everything should be created end to end. And if we've got the rocks, then we should be able to produce the batteries or whatever it is, right? First of all, it's more complicated than that because you need multiple minerals. So very few places have all of them. But also that unless you have a large enough proportion of the global source, it's very difficult to just shut your borders and say, you've got to produce it here or you've got to process it here. So a few countries have done it successfully. Indonesia is the most famous example with nickel. But other countries took them to the WTO to try and force them to not do that, even though economically it's been a huge success story. And now they're investing some of those revenues in renewable resources. I think the global landscape is quite complicated when it comes to imposing border controls on resources. And some of the people, some of the nations who are maybe most on the side of the angels when it comes to what they say about climate ambitions, my own country, the EU, the US, are not always on the side of the angels when it comes to supporting countries that want to develop their own industries, is unfortunately reality. And actually, China is often the country that is first to say, okay, fine, we'll set up a processing plant. We'll come and we'll invest and we'll sit. So the geopolitics of it is really interesting and really complex. Our instinct right now is that unless you have more than 25, 30% of the world's supply, you shouldn't be looking at to any kind of border control. But what you should be looking at is really getting the most value possible out of your mining activity. And there are lots of things that countries can do in terms of how their fiscal regimes are structured that will allow them to do more of that. And one of the other reasons why value addition doesn't happen more is because companies struggle to find the parts, the machinery, the manufacturing expertise, et cetera, or processing expertise in country. And so the other thing that the countries can do is really invest in their skills and training around like the value chain or the value chain, if that makes sense. So who's going to supply your machines, who's going to service them, who's going to do your ops, et cetera. And we see a lot of potential job creation and opportunity there, even if it's not directly in the processing.
And so while we're on the topic of raw materials and natural resources and how they can really benefit a lot of these countries, I wanted to bring up the question that, for a little background, a number of renewable energy projects in the US that I've seen really tend to benefit higher income regions while harming low income communities, causing lots of environmental justice issues. And I've seen some reports of similar issues in Africa, particularly among that mining of renewable materials. So I wanted to ask what you think can be done to ensure that the global shift towards renewable energy is equitable and sustainable for Africa.
Yeah. I don't know that there are any good, quick answers on this one. I think it's really complex. So there are multiple levels to take it out. One is just, can we globally cope if we reduce what is euphemistically described as overburden in mining circles, but to everyone else's forest to get at the minerals? So even if we dig up all the minerals, make all the batteries, transition everyone to electricity, if we haven't got the forests to provide the ecological benefits, biodiversity, create the rain, etc., we may well have not bothered, right? There's definitely a version of truth that points to that challenge and the tension between planetary boundaries and demand for minerals is real. And that unfortunately is not a problem that can be solved by anyone within the African continent. That's due to consumer demand for very large electric vehicles. And that is something that I think is going to be very difficult politically for US legislators, for European legislators to manage, right? Weaning people off passenger vehicles is going to be hard, but maybe very important. 70% of the demand for critical minerals comes from EVs. So that is like the big thing that we need to think about whether or not we can afford. We have looked at various ways of just reducing demand. And one of them would be to move more of the industry to Africa, because you can reduce the total demand by about 10% just by moving everything to Africa. I know sounds a bit glib, but essentially because you've got much higher quality of renewables, you don't need nearly as much battery storage. So that is one thing we've looked at. I think the other challenge is then understanding kind of just much better how much the planet can tolerate. And there are some really clever people doing work on no-go mining zones. So you can touch this forest and we'll survive, but you can't touch this forest kind of work. There are also people, of course, who would say that let's not be so reliant on electricity. Let's look at hydrogen. Let's not moving everything to an electricity basis, but looking at different options. And I think that some of the breakthroughs in hydrogen and some of the ways that we think about how hydrogen are going to be used will probably come from the geopolitics and not wanting to be so reliant on one battery source than it will from any cost advantage or whatever in hydrogen. And then there's the human aspect. And mining companies do not have a great track record when it comes to community relations, creating quality jobs, fulfilling their commitments when it comes to education and health and everything that they're supposed to do for their communities. I think that my hope, but I think it is a hope and it's probably an optimistic one, is that with the increasing scrutiny that they are now under as the kind of power source to the world, and as that shifts from the oil companies to the mining companies, that there will be an increased kind of scrutiny on how responsible mining. And there are certainly mining companies who are demanding a higher price should be paid for responsible mining, in the same way that car companies have agreed to pay a higher price for green steel. The responsible miners are saying, why should we take on all these additional costs that we're not going to be compensated for it? So that is a really interesting evolving area. But I think the big fear is that we don't have great examples of best practice of what good looks like. And we've been doing mining for millennia and we still don't really have a good example of kind of pointing to this is how you do it ethically. This is how you make sure it's distributed fairly. There are a few examples of where, for example, Botswana and the diamonds, there's a good sovereign wealth fund and the resources have been appropriately invested in education and the country has benefited there. It's a really small country, population-wise. So I think it's a big challenge and it's definitely one that I think both whether we can afford to dig up all the minerals and also how we do it in an ethical way, I think are both questions which there's a general reluctance to engage with at scale because it's just so hard. Right. And we thought we'd come up with the answer by saying it's okay, we'll just electrify everything. And now to stop and say, okay, but we may not be able to afford to, that is, I think, not yet in the mainstream discussion.
Yeah, so I think it's clear that a lot of the solutions you mentioned, especially moving a lot of industry to be more local, does require a lot of funding and investment. So I think one of the ways these could possibly be funded is through carbon markets, which I feel like have been a valuable tool to incentivize environmentally friendly behavior. However, I've seen reports that Africa accounts for as little as 2% of carbon credits issued globally, despite their incredible potential of its natural resources. So I just wanted to ask what you think can be done to leverage this opportunity to maybe help provide the funding required to drive these kind of local changes.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think the carbon markets have been under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of projects in Africa have been under significant scrutiny in the last couple of years, which has made things challenging for some of the project developers. I think simplistically, and I'll keep my answer short because this isn't as much my area, but right now, African credits, you can only buy them and sell them on the voluntary markets, not on the compliance market. And the price in the compliance markets is significantly higher, many multiples higher than in the voluntary market. And many of the project developers who design their project assuming carbon revenue of maybe $10 a ton, $20 a ton, maybe even $30, $40 a ton might now be receiving 2 or 6. Yeah. And so the economics in projects are just really challenging. There is a couple of different solutions to that. One is to try and figure out a way for African credits to be part of compliance markets or authorized credits. My colleagues on our policy and regulation team are working on that and how to help countries get to the point where they can have authorized credits, which would command a higher price. The other is to increase the co-benefits of the credits, to be able to demonstrate in a high integrity way all the other benefits that the project is generating beyond just the carbon. So, for example, in a forestry project, maybe there are employment opportunities, maybe there are entrepreneurship opportunities as part of that project. And that being able to demonstrate in a higher integrity way would allow you then to command a higher price, even within the voluntary market. So we're doing a lot of work on what that would look like, and particularly on the concept of benefit sharing. And so how benefits are shared with communities and what does that look like, and trying to put together some best practice for different countries as this develops. I think, yeah, it's a very rapidly evolving kind of area, and there are different ways forward. But like any new market, there's also been a ton of things that we probably won't do again in the future. And I think we're in a bit of a period of unsticking and rebuilding.
Again, based on your answer, it seems like a lot of the restricting factors here, honestly, a lot of the time just come down to funding or financial incentive. So obviously, CAPE is not just about philanthropy, but actually driving real economic returns to reward participants in a more green ecosystem. So I was wondering what you think about how can both businesses and policymakers in Africa work together to drive a more green economy, and whether you have any examples of this.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the working together bit is really critical. I mentioned earlier the initiative of the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative. And what we're seeing there is, even though we're quite early on in this area of green industry, there's already a ton of businesses, project developers, investors who see opportunities and would like to develop those opportunities. And there are also governments who see real opportunities. And Namibia famously has put a huge amount of effort and resource towards developing a green hydrogen economy. Mauritania sees a lot of opportunity in both green hydrogen and their green steel. Guinea is going to have the world's largest iron ore mine that has a ore of a quality that can produce green steel. So governments are seeing the opportunity, businesses are seeing the opportunity, investors are seeing the opportunities. The world is not yet configured, and government in particular and policy is often not yet configured to allow those projects to move forward at a pace, often because it requires much greater integration across ministries that previously haven't necessarily had to work together. And so we see that sort of time and time again, that can be a real challenge. And it's quite a chicken and egg. So as much as there's a real need for capital, there's also just a huge need for capacity. When I compare one of the pieces of work that we worked on was the review of debt, nature, and climate. So it's a sort of global financial architecture review looking at the interplay between those different things. And it's chaired by Kenya, Germany, Colombia, and France. And when we just compare the number of bodies that the French and German teams are able to bring to negotiate the term and put it together versus the number of bodies that Kenya is able to bring, again, it's multiples different. And Kenya, I think, is very well resourced with people who understand and are expert in some of these topics. One thing is just capacity, right? It's just like number of people who can do this kind of work and can engage in these types of issues, and to be able to follow that cycle round between business seeing an opportunity and presenting it to government, and government then being able to respond and create the space to the opportunity. And similarly, government saying, we want to drive investment in this area, and then business being able to respond and say, okay, in order to do that, we need X, Y, Z. And that for that to be fair and equitable on both sides. And I gave the example of Botswana as a sort of positive example of where a great resource windfall has been used effectively by government. There are also a number of examples of where that has not been the case, and where businesses had to manage multiple changes of like tax regime, of royalty regimes, etc. And it makes it really hard to invest and really hard to plan. I think figuring out the right forum for the communication and ensuring that government in particular has sufficient resources to engage in the sort of planning and proactivity that's required will be critical. There's a great example that some colleagues shared from Oman where they want to develop green hydrogen, and they have decided to auction plots of land. So they've said basically, okay, in this 100 square miles, you're going to get this much power because we know how much sun falls and we know how much wind there is. And with that power, you could produce this much green hydrogen. And you, as the project developer, you're going to tell us how much you think that's worth. And we'll run an auction to essentially auction the right to produce green hydrogen in those areas. And they've made sure the areas are co-located with ports and with transport infrastructure. And they've got their gas infrastructure, which can be adaptive for the green hydrogen. And that's a really great example of kind of very proactive government policy to drive the creation of a new industry. Because that is basically what we're talking about. Garment manufacturing in India and Bangladesh, or tech in Taiwan and South Korea. It's going to take government intervention in a way that hasn't been seen in a long time, which is why people are now talking about industrial policy in a way that we just didn't 10 years ago, which is exciting, but it also will require a lot of resource and a lot of effort. And some of that is money, but it's also people as well.
Yeah. So I guess based on both financial and what seems to be the structural limitations for a lot of these developing industries, what area of industrialization do you think has the most potential to drive a more green economy in Africa, both in the near and long term?
Yeah. I think there's probably two areas where we see the most immediate potential. One is on direct substitution of things that are currently imported. So in lots of countries, and again, I'll use Kenya as an example because I live here. For example, Kenya imports almost all of its fertilizer. The fertilizer that it imports is produced using fossil fuels. And so when, for example, Russia invades Ukraine and the price of fossil fuels goes through the roof, so does the price of fertilizer. And Kenya has to spend very important dollar reserves to buy that fertilizer. Green ammonia produced from green hydrogen, which Kenya can produce at scale. And there's a company called Talus Renewables, which is doing it in a modular way. It's more kits and it's captive power, so it's not reliant on grid power. They can be cost competitive today against that imported fertilizer. And any farmer anywhere in the world will always be trying to reduce the cost of their inputs, right? So there are real opportunities, I think, in those direct import substitutions, particularly where it helps governments stabilize their currency because they're not having to spend as much of their hard currency reserves. So that would be true in Kenya, that would be true in places like Nigeria and lots of other countries, right? So that's one area. And then I think the other is the example of the kind of Microsoft, which is we're running out of power, we're running out of space. Who's got a huge amount of power and they're not using it? Okay, cool. Let's move that quickly, right? So I think those are probably the two that we're going to see most quickly because, and it's important to be honest about this, right now it's not cost competitive when you compare most of the green alternatives to their conventional fuel cousins. And whether it's regulation, whether it's just a scarcity motive, there has to be something that breaks that paradigm in order to get those projects to a scale where suddenly that price does start to come down. I think the one thing that we've been doing a lot of work on, which would help on the cost, is the cost of power. And in some projects, so for example, in green hydrogen, the cost of power is 70% of the final cost. And it's 30% of a mine's inputs. It's 40%. Like it's a significant factor when you're considering your cost basis. If you can bring that down, you make a huge difference just in one go. And it's an interesting and sort of complex picture, and I'll try and do it as quickly. So in general, when you're comparing business to switch from fossil fuels to renewables, that is cost competitive today in the vast majority of cases. When you're looking at power at a grid level, when you have to balance the power, so to compensate for the fact that intermittent renewables aren't available all the time, it gets a bit more complicated. But there are some really interesting approaches that are being tried with power pools, with storage, with different types of storage, which are starting to address that. And there's a whole load of very complicated licensing and policy that needs to be unpicked and redesigned to allow for those different approaches to take over. Because you're moving from a model where you can put your source of power anywhere, pretty much, to a model where your source of power doesn't move, isn't mutable, but you potentially maybe can move what the power is needed for in the case of industry. And that requires a sort of different way of thinking about power systems that is working its way through, but it will take some time.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting how you bring up the point, these kind of the two solutions of making it financially competitive or cost competitive, and also having a driver like government regulation and how they have to work together in order to achieve these goals. So for my last question, I'd just like to ask what you think young people can do to help support things like your mission in Africa. Are there things that we can do to push institutions and policymakers in our countries to support Africa's potential to lead the fight against climate change?
Oh my gosh. I think the first thing is it's a massive field. It really is like the future of humanity big. And so there is huge space for everyone when you're thinking about career paths. And I think don't first of all, just don't think about it as a monolith. You don't need a degree in environmental science or to learn like the latest sustainability codes or to be an expert in carbon markets. There are a million different ways to have a career that kind of moves this great sort of super tanker to the good. So first of all, just find your niche and find something you enjoy and focus on that because the problem is enormous and it's not going anywhere. I think there are definitely shifts in attitude that can really help. So when I talk to family and friends back in the UK, I get a lot of questions about, but why would you want to do industry when people don't still have power? Or why would you want to solve for this when you haven't got this? So I think getting educated about the realities of the opportunity can really help in the kind of dialogue and discourse. I think there's a real role for understanding how interconnected our world is and how much some of our collective choices around what kind of vehicles we allow, what kind of life choices we make, how much those are connected to demand for resources. And so really understanding how some of these value chains work. There's a brilliant and really accessible book called Material World by Ed Conway, which kind of takes some of these value chains and traces it back. And you would be I made my whole team read it, but it's fascinating and it really helps one understand how connected we all are in a way that I think we've forgotten in some ways. And then I think there's a huge role for activism and young people in the last few years have, I hope I'm still a young person, but have really shown us how powerful those voices can be. I think there's also a real world for rolling up with sleeves and getting stuck in. And I think some of the people that I most respect who are doing this work actually are working for mining companies or they're working in the renewable energy business of an oil major because actually the people with capital are going to be the people that benefited most from the old world order and help throughout finding ways to figure out how to shift them towards the new world order, I think is going to be like the great work of our generation. Because right now, that money is not shifting fast enough. And there's even been some backsliding. And I think those who have the stomach for that fight, and they absolutely is a fight, I really commend them. So I think also just respecting people's choices as well. If someone tells you they're going to go and work for Exxon or whatever, listen and support them to help those businesses move as well, because we need their resources as much as we need the activists fighting for environmental justice as well.
And I just think you bring up such a great point that there's a niche for everybody in this field, and that we're really going to make the most impact if people are doing what they're actually interested in. So I think no matter what field you think you're going into, there's a way you can loop it into this problem and make a significant impact. So that was my last question. This has been it's truly a fascinating conversation. I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and share your insights and for dedicating your career to impact in the environment. So for anyone interested in learning more about Emily and her team's mission at the Climate Action Platform for Africa, you can visit their website at cap-a.org. So cap-a.org. And yeah, thanks again, Emily.
You are so welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please like and subscribe and visit us at WattSherpa.com.